Good morning, everyone. Welcome to New Hampshire Business Review webinar, The 4 Pillars of Creating and Sustaining a Mentally Healthy Workplace Culture. I'm Ernesto Burden. I'm the publisher of New Hampshire Business Review, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this today. I think it's an incredibly important discussion, and we have two really powerful speakers on this topic that I think deservedly have a tremendous reputation in this state and beyond on this topic. So I would like to thank our sponsor today, Dartmouth-Hitchcock, for making this presentation possible, and introduce our two speakers. We have, first up will be John Broderick, Senior Director of External Affairs at Dartmouth-Hitchcock, and then Kim LaMontagne, MBA, President and CEO of Kim LaMontagne, LLC. The format of the presentation today will be John will speak first, Kim will follow him with her 4 pillars presentation, and then the two of them together will join us for a Q&A. Please feel free to put your questions into the chat. We'll field as many of those as time permits, and beyond that, I'm anxious to jump right into this. So let's bring John up first.
Ernesto, good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning to everyone who's tuning in. I appreciate your being here. This topic this morning is really important, and I'm sure that's why you're tuning in. Just by way of brief background as to what I'm doing here at all, in my day job for years, I was a judge on our Supreme Court and a dean of the law school, neither of which qualify me to be here today. But my family dealt with mental health problems in a very public way, and I made a lot of mistakes which compounded those problems. And through the grace of Dartmouth-Hitchcock, where I've worked now for 4+ years, and because of the genius of a psychologist by the name of Barbara Van Dalen, I've devoted the last 5 years of my life to traveling and speaking in northern New England. I've traveled 90,000 miles. I've spoken to almost 100,000 kids in 250 gyms and auditoriums about mental health awareness. And I've learned a lot about what kids are dealing with, and they've shared their stories with me. And it has really become the purpose in my life to change the culture. And nowhere is that more important, by the way, than in the business community. You have huge impact over tens of thousands of our citizens. And as Kim LaMontagne will describe you today, it's not just a good idea and a nice thing to do, but it's an economic imperative to do. And what I'd like to do in the few minutes I have at the front end of this is maybe put up a slide or two of some mental health statistics on adolescents in our state and in the neighboring state of Maine. So if that could hit the screen, that'd be great. These are Youth Risk Behavioral Survey numbers. They are the result of a questionnaire performed by the Center for Disease Control. It's sent out to high schools all across the United States. As you can see, the first slide is what those results are for 2019. All of that, by the way, before COVID struck. They give this test every 2 years. This year's test will be given, I think, next month. I expect those numbers, sadly, to rise. When I first saw these numbers 4 years ago and learned about these statistics, I was really shocked by it. I'm not shocked by it now because I've hugged those statistics in many, many places. But very briefly, the New Hampshire numbers, which are slightly better, not greatly better, but slightly better than the national numbers, will show you the number of high school girls and boys who are depressed. And they don't ask them to identify themselves by name. So these are anonymous surveys. 42% of high school girls in New Hampshire are depressed. It doesn't say, are you depressed? The question is, have you been sad or hopeless for 2 consecutive weeks or longer in the last 12 months, such that you haven't been able to engage in normal everyday activity? 43% of them. 22% of high school girls in our state in 2019, before COVID, said they had given serious consideration, that's the question, to ending their own life in the last 12 months. 16% had actually made plans to kill themselves, and over 8% had attempted suicide. I don't know about you, but that was not my childhood. That was not my life growing up. The numbers in Maine, which are on the next slide, are very similar to what they are in our state, and they're very similar to all states across the United States. And I pointed out because I have hugged your future workforce. I know who they are. I know they're coming. The good news is this generation of kids, Generation Z and millennials too, are smarter than I was, more informed than I ever was, better educated than I was. But they also are dealing with stressors that I didn't deal with, and probably you didn't deal with either. And so they are dealing with mental health issues, and they will not join and will not remain at a workplace that is not understanding of that and is not supportive of it. Let me give you some very brief numbers from a Harvard Business Review study, which was about a year and a half ago. 1/2 of all millennials, ages 24 to 39, 1/2, said they had left the job, at least in part, because of mental health. When you get to Generation Z, ages 18 to 23, 75% of those responding said they had left the job, at least in part, because of mental health. The population as a whole would be 20%. So you can see how different those numbers are. And this generation has dealt with problems we didn't. We have bled work into all of our lives. The gap between work and home and work and school is almost gone. And this young generation is dealing with pressures we did not. Free time is hard to find. Vacations are a luxury most people say they can't afford. COVID has made their lives lonelier than they were. And they're dealing with student debt that most of us didn't deal with, certainly not at these levels, and housing costs that we didn't have to deal with at these levels. And they're probably going to have multiple jobs in their lifetime, which is somewhat of a new phenomenon. At least that wasn't the expectation for a lot of generations. And lastly, every generation of Americans, as we've heard, because it happens to be true, have done better than their parents. This generation is not so sure that will be true for them. They'll work longer and harder and more jobs and with more stressors than we had. In any event, I think it's important that we understand who they are. They also have incredible strengths, by the way. I love this generation. I really mean that. But the employer that's going to retain them and benefit from their productivity, and they will be productive, has to understand what their challenges are and has to deal with it. And with that, I'd like to turn this over to Kim LaMontagne, who has her own story, which is extraordinary. And she does really important work. And that'll be obvious to all of you pretty shortly. But anyway, Kim, good to see you. I'll leave the screen and leave it to you.
Oh, good to see you, John. Thank you so much for that, that introduction. And I just want to thank everyone for being here today. Thank you to Dartmouth-Hitchcock for sponsoring this content today, and to New Hampshire Business Review for bringing this critical content to everyone. And I'm trying to figure out how to share my screen. So I am going to talk a little bit today about the 4 pillars of creating and sustaining a mentally healthy workplace culture. But before that, I'd like you to hear a little bit about my story. So on this screen right here, that's 3 versions of me. It's also 3 versions of me as a top performer. Top performer in the corporate workplace my entire corporate career. I was a leader, I was a trailblazer, a coach, a mentor, one that people looked up to, one that people wondered, how in the world does she create the relationships and the partnerships, and how does she do the things that she actually does in the workplace? No one knew that behind that mask of high performance, I was actually suffering in complete silence with major depression, anxiety, persistent suicidal thoughts, and alcohol misuse. Because I had a wall of masks that I hid behind in the workplace and also outside of the workplace to hide the fact that I was in so much pain and I was ashamed. I honestly felt ashamed and unworthy, and I felt like I didn't matter. I felt like my life didn't matter. And it was a very difficult time. Oops, I think I just lost my screen. Hold on one second. There we go. It was a very difficult journey for me in the corporate workspace. Every night, I would have 5, 6, 7, 8 glasses of wine per night. I never drank during the day or during work hours, but it was something that I had to do each and every night. The following days, every morning, I would wake up with hangovers. I would black out in the evening and wonder what happened the night before. But during that time frame, I still remained a top performer in the workplace. One year, prior to me getting sober, I had won Director's Choice Award at a corporate sales summit. That Director's Choice Award was meant for the person who was the Director's Choice, the leader, the trailblazer, the one who my director wanted to recognize for a job well done. I was humbled to receive that award, but I also felt like an imposter because my director and my colleagues knew nothing about what was going on behind my mask of high performance. I went out that night with my colleagues to celebrate like we always did. And in usual fashion, I had too much to drink. I got back to my hotel room in Baltimore, Maryland, and never informed my husband at the time that I was safe and sound in my room. He was up in New Hampshire. I woke up the next morning to over 30 text messages and phone calls from my husband, my director, and my coworkers, because my husband was so afraid, since he didn't hear from me that I was safe in my room, that he went onto my company's website and found contact information for my coworkers and my manager and reached out to them. Now, I also learned that day that I woke up that there was a fire alarm the night before in the hotel. There was a fire alarm the night that I won Director's Choice Award. I was the only person in that hotel who did not evacuate because I was passed out in my room. Now, that's not something I'm proud of, but it's reality. And it happened to me, and no one had a clue that I was suffering in silence. I have been sober now for 12 years. On July 16th, 2009, I made the phone call to my doctor's office that saved my life, and I was met by the most kind, non-judgmental nurse practitioner one could ever ask for. That nurse practitioner created a safe container within the 4 walls of that exam room. And he said, Kim, you are suffering, living with a mental health condition and a substance misuse or alcohol misuse problem. We are going to do this together, and I am going to support you through your entire recovery process. When I got sober, things got a heck of a lot worse. They actually got so bad that in 2013, I was almost one of those statistics that John Broderick just shared on your screen. I had a plan, and I knew how I wanted to end my life. Something intervened, and I never went through with that plan. But behind those masks of high performance was a girl who was on the verge of suicide. And it wasn't until 2016 when I had a conversation with my leader who noticed the subtle signs that something was off with me. She got on a plane from Newark, New Jersey and flew up to Boston and spent the day with me. And what happened that day is nothing short of amazing. And every leader should take a page out of her story. She said, Kim, can you please be open and honest with me about what's going on? I am here to support you. I see some subtle signs that things are wrong, and I want to support you. I'm not a counselor, but I want to make sure I get you to the right resources because something is going on with my top performer. And I shared my entire story with her, and she looked at me and said, how in the world have you been operating at the level you've been operating at? with all of these issues going on behind the scene? I said, I don't know. She gave me permission to take extra time off around Memorial Day weekend 2016. That's when we had that conversation together. And that extra time off that she gave me allowed me to go on a weekend retreat where I found someone who, by the name of Byron Katie, I went to a weekend conference and I learned how to challenge all of those stressful, horrible thoughts that I had in my mind. And it was my turning point for getting better. I then started speaking as a trained presenter with the National Alliance on Mental Illness in their In Our Own Voice program. And I noticed that every time I would go out and share my story in the workplace, people would come forward, just like kids come forward and they hug John for saying, thank you so much for sharing your story. I was having corporate professionals, senior leaders approaching me, thanking me for being vulnerable, and then admitting to me that they suffer too. As a matter of fact, I had 13 senior vice presidents approach me after doing a 1-hour presentation at a conference in Houston back in 2018, where I shared my story. There were 150 senior vice presidents of HR and talent development and nursing at this conference. And I bravely stood up and shared my story, and 13 of them stepped forward. That is when I knew I needed to figure out a way to leave my corporate job, which was a full-time director's role, and commit my full-time, all of my time to teaching and training leaders about mental health in the workplace. And the 5 things that I've learned by doing this work is that employees who are living with a mental health challenge rarely feel like their place of work is a place of safety. They're afraid of speaking openly. I was afraid of being judged, losing my seat at the corporate table, maybe even being fired. I've also learned that employees thrive when they're in a safe environment. I thrived when my leader had that conversation with me because she said, this is a judgment-free zone. You are safe here. I want to help you. I've also learned that employees are afraid to ask for help because of judgment, retribution, or job loss. That's exactly what happened to me. But when I finally got the help I needed, I began to heal. The 4th thing that I've learned is that stigma and discrimination thrive on lack of knowledge and understanding. And there's a lot of lack of knowledge and understanding around mental health challenges and substance misuse. But one of the most important things that I've learned is that leaders lead by example, and leaders have the power to transform the workplace culture. So what I did on April 1 of 2020, in the middle of the COVID pandemic, is I stepped away from my director's role, doubled down with 2 of my coaches, and I created the 4 pillars of creating and sustaining a mentally healthy workplace culture, which is a corporate training that teaches leaders how to normalize the conversation about mental health and well-being in the workplace. And the 4 pillars that I have learned or that I have discovered are the key pillars of creating a mentally healthy workplace culture is number 1, we have to recognize the impact of mental health and well-being in the workplace, and more importantly, the impact if we're not addressing it. Number 2, sharing the lived experience brings the human connection to mental health. I just shared a snippet of my story, and I may have connected the dots or connected with several of you who are watching today. Sharing that lived experience brings the human connection to a very often stigmatized illness. Changing their perception about mental health in the workplace is a key pillar. That involves decreasing stigma and changing to person-centered, less non-stigmatizing language in the workplace. And then that 4th pillar is really to create a safe workplace environment where employees feel safe and protected, enough so that they can speak openly about mental health and well-being in the workplace. So just a couple of stats up here. 1 in 5 people experience a mental health episode in their lifetime. And I want you to stop with that statistic right now and think about the number of employees in your own organization. If 1 in 5 are suffering, and I would probably tend to think that many of those who are suffering in silence, how many people in that organization, in your organization, does that represent? Number 2, mental illness is more common than cancer, diabetes, and heart disease combined. We don't have a problem talking about cancer, diabetes, or heart disease, but we still have hurdles and problems speaking about a mental health condition that trumps the numbers of cancer, diabetes, and heart disease combined. Depression is the most common mental health condition, not surprised. And the numbers are going up because of COVID. And then the last statistic on here is that globally, mental illness is the leading cause of disability and accounts for up to 40% in some countries. That's affecting your bottom line. So recognizing that we must address mental health and well-being in the workplace is really the first step to making change. In terms of changing their perception about mental health and well-being, stigma and discrimination, as I said, thrives on lack of knowledge. Here are some compelling reasons, 4 of them specifically, to address stigma in the workplace. Stigma is the single greatest barrier to treating mental illness. People are afraid to come forward because of stigma. They're afraid of being assigned a stigmatizing label if they admit that they are living with a mental health condition. What happens next? They decide to stay silent, which only perpetuates the problem. Silence is toxic. Stigma can be detrimental to the individual due to withdrawal or a decrease in support from loved ones and colleagues. It can cause shunning and exclusion, and honestly, the 4th one, it's unjust. And for leaders in the workplace, if you look at the bottom of the screen, you'll see some of the impact of stigma in the workplace. It could cause stereotyping, bullying, harassment, disability, loss of employment, fear, shame, and silence. And with the job market the way it is right now, recruitment is key, but retention is even more important. So really finding a way to help decrease stigma in the workplace is critical. And that's what I teach leaders in this program. One of the ways that we can help decrease stigma, and this is one of my most favorite things to talk about, is language. We must change to non-stigmatizing, non-discriminatory, person-centered language. On the left-hand side of your screen, you will see a list of words, very discriminatory. Addict, nuts, junkie, alcoholic, schizophrenic, psycho, on the wagon, off the wagon. Those are all words that many of us still use. I have shifted away from all of those words. I no longer call myself an alcoholic. I am a person who lives with alcohol use disorder. So on the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see additional non-discriminatory, person-centered, recovery-focused language. So let's talk about family, friends, coworkers, loved ones. If they are living with a mental illness, if they are living with bipolar, let's not reference them as being bipolar. Let's call them a person living with bipolar disorder. If they're living with addiction, let's not call them an addict. Let's call them a person living with addiction. By changing the language that we're using, it helps to bring that human connection. I was actually at up at the Department of Safety in Concord yesterday, meeting with one of the top leaders up there. And we were in a discussion about the suicide rates within the department and fire and EMS and how they're all suffering. And he shared with me that one of his officers had committed suicide. And we had a really great discussion. And after he shared the story, I asked him, or I invited him to shift his language a little bit about that. And he was open. I said, how about we talk about suicide? Instead of saying committed suicide, we rephrase that and say that he died by suicide. And I asked him, I said, do you know why that is? And he says, yes. And then he sat back and thought, and he said, actually, I don't know why you're asking me to do that. I said, well, let me explain. When someone commits something, it insinuates that it was an intentional thing that they did. If someone were to die of a heart attack, die of a stroke, we would never say that that person committed a heart attack or committed a stroke. They died by the final symptom of that disease. A light went on in his head and he said, and I said, your officer, anyone who is dying by suicide is dying by the final symptom of their mental health condition. It's small tweaks like that in the workplace, in the language that we use, that can make all the difference in the world. And going back to that 1 in 5 statistic, think about the office pre-COVID. It's Monday morning, we're all around the water cooler having a conversation, and I'm the 1 in 5 who's standing in that conversation, and I'm living with undisclosed alcohol misuse and severe depression. And my coworkers are talking about our coworker, John Smith, who went off the rails this past weekend because he's a crazy nut psycho junkie alcoholic, and he checked himself into the loony bin. And my goodness, when he comes back to work, I'm going to distance myself from him because he is just psycho. That is a very derogatory, stigmatizing, unfortunate conversation, and a conversation that I would never step forward into and admit that I was having a problem. But I teach leaders to shift that conversation to something like this. I am so proud of our coworker, John. I was unaware that he was living with substance misuse and with alcohol misuse, but I am so proud that he found the strength to come forward and admit that he needs help. And I'm going to support him through his recovery process. And when he comes back, I will make sure that he feels safe, seen, heard, and understood, and have access to all the right resources to continue to keep him healthy, because he matters. He's a human being. He's a person. If I was part of that second conversation, I may step forward and say, you know what? I am just like John, and I suffer too. So that's a little bit about the power of language. And in terms of creating a mentally healthy workplace culture, it really does start at the top. There was a LinkedIn post from the CEO of Cisco Systems that I saw last week. I think John Broderick sent it to me. He sent an email to 75,000 of his employees and said, we recognize that mental health and well-being is challenging, and we are going to devote extra time and resources to employee health and well-being. But most importantly, he said to all 75,000 of his employees that it's okay to not be okay. One leader, one CEO, one email message saying it's okay to not be okay, and over 100 of his employees stepped forward, thanked him, and admitted that they suffer too. So by embedding that commitment to mental well-being in the core mission and values of the organization, it makes a difference. It allows employees to feel and understand that the organization is committed to addressing mental health and well-being in the workplace. Training leaders to identify and support employees in distress is another key ingredient to creating a mentally healthy workplace culture. Now, I don't teach and train leaders to become counselors. That is not their role, but I do teach and train them about the obvious signs and the subtle signs, and how to feel confident that they have the tools to be able to start the conversation and crosswalk that employee to the right services. Another key ingredient is identifying internal champions to evangelize the commitment to mental health and well-being in the workplace. Creating peer support groups where people who are steadfast in their recovery, like myself, are willing to be an internal champion and spread the word that in this workplace, it is okay to not be okay. We can speak freely, and we have committed to creating a judgment-free zone within this workplace. We need to build awareness of resources in person and online. We need to form mental health task force or committees, shift to using that person-centered language. But most importantly, I teach leaders to create a culture of safety in their organization. And by that, I mean that a culture of safety is a culture where everyone feels safe speaking openly about mental health without fear of judgment, retribution, or job loss. Now is the time to address mental health and well-being in the workplace. And as a leader, you could be suffering yourself personally. I encourage you to take a look internally, and if you need help, to not be afraid to ask for it. Many leaders who are mid-level or at the top, they feel isolated. They're wearing that suit of armor, and there's no way that they feel that they can be open. Now, I'm not telling leaders or anyone to share their entire story like I do, but to be able to model what a healthy workplace culture looks like is critical. And I'm going to stop right there and see, John, do you have any thoughts, feedback on any of this content? I know the two of us are very much aligned in terms of what it is that we're presenting and sharing, but from your perspective, I would love to get your thoughts on this.
No, I want to just put an exclamation point next to everything Kim has just told you, and it comes from a place of authenticity, as you can see. I think the point that I want to emphasize is that it's so important for leaders in companies to let their employees know it's okay not to be okay, and to show some vulnerability themselves. If you speak to police chiefs, as I have done in both Nashua and Manchester in the recent past, because the leading cause of death among on-the-job death of police officers in America is suicide. That was never talked about. But those police chiefs in their departments have made it a very high priority. They're not talking about it, letting people know, as Kim suggested, it's okay not to be okay. Commissioner Quinn at the Department of Safety, who's being recognized this year as the champion by Riverbend Community Mental Health, has started a wellness and resiliency office. Kim's been instrumental in helping him do that, by the way, for all 1,600 employees and their families. Hats off to Commissioner Quinn. He's finally willing to talk about it. The other thing I just want to emphasize and put an exclamation point next to is what Kim's talking about for businesses is not just a good-hearted thing to do. It's a really smart thing to do. And what you will find is what others have found around the country and around the globe. It will increase your profits. Why is that? Your turnover will be less. Your absenteeism will decline. Mental health issues and substance issues are one of the leading causes of absenteeism. According to a recent study, by the way, businesses in the United States, their employees, took 217 million sick days because of mental health and substance. You can put a dollar sign next to that. And there's something the economists have come up with, which is a great term, I think. It's called presenteeism. So you're present at work, you're not absent, but you might as well be for about 2.5 days a month because your mind is elsewhere. And your productivity will decline. Employee morale will decline if we keep mental health and substance kind of in the shadows where it's comfortably been for generations. The other thing you'll notice is that your physical health costs associated with your employees and your workers' comp plans and your disability plans will go down. So you will save money. So in my view, it's not only the right thing to do, which is pretty important. It's also the smart thing to do. And stigma is crippling. And I know that, Kim, from all of my hugs with kids as young as the 6th grade who have told me they're ashamed of their mental health or their parents don't want to talk about it. It's not right. And as Will Torrey, who's the head of psychiatry at Dartmouth-Hitchcock, he calls the way we treat mental health in America discrimination. I was happy to see Kim use that word because it is discrimination. It used to be that way, by the way, with cancer, where we whispered it. If we said it out loud, we might say he or she has the C word. It was that way in the 80s with HIV, not anymore. And so what Kim's telling you is, I think, in a nice, respectful way, if you want to support your staff, you want to keep your staff, and you want to increase your bottom line, you need to embrace this issue. And her 4 pillars, and particularly Kim as the ambassador of those pillars, is incredibly compelling. And the time is now.
Thank you, John. And I'm glad that you brought up presenteeism. I was going to address presenteeism as well. And just to kind of dovetail on that, presenteeism is more costly than absenteeism because it's not quite clear to the degree that the employee is suffering. When someone calls out from work, you're not expecting any productivity from that person. But if someone shows up to work because they're too afraid to say, I'm not okay, they're showing up and producing at about 1/3 of their capacity. Even though I was a top performer, I experienced presenteeism in the workplace because there were many times I would show up on a Skype call back in the day or a Zoom call, and I would just barely make it through that call. And as soon as the call would be done, I would shut off the camera and I would just fall to pieces. I was not performing at my highest level because I was too afraid to say I'm not okay. And I wanted to talk to you very quickly about a concept as well that is a result of stigma. It's a concept that I've recently learned about called label avoidance. Label avoidance is when people, employees, decide not to seek treatment for a stigmatized disease because they do not want to be assigned a stigmatizing label. Label avoidance is dangerous, but label avoidance exists, and it also exists in the workplace. And in terms of supporting people who are in the workplace, I actually completed my MBA program back in 2017, and I worked with the National Alliance on Mental Illness in Massachusetts to evaluate the outcome of a grant-funded program they had back then called CEOs Against Stigma. And there was a survey done with along with Massachusetts voters, about 800 of them. There were hundreds of questions in this survey, but there were a few questions that stood out. Number 1, would you feel comfortable telling your family that you are living with a mental health condition? 92% said yes. The other question was, would you feel comfortable telling a coworker if you are living with a mental health condition? The number dropped from 92% down to 27%. Now, I will tell you, in 2017, when I was still working in corporate, my vice president at the time had said, Kim, I applaud you for all of the work that you're doing in the space of mental health by sharing your story and being vulnerable. I want you to come at the next sales meeting and teach and train your team on what you're doing. Now that involved sharing my story. And at this point, I had not been open about being sober. At that point, I was 8 years sober, but I was still not speaking openly about it in the workplace because I was still a little bit afraid. So I stood up in front of 35 of my own coworkers at a business development sales summit with 2 vice presidents in the audience, my entire business development sales team, human resources, marketing, and I shared my story. And to say that you could hear a pin drop in that room is an understatement. No one got up for coffee, moved, or went to the bathroom because I was describing a Kim LaMontagne who was suicidal, depressed, anxious, and I was describing someone that they had never seen before or heard of before. After I finished sharing my story, 8 of my own coworkers stepped forward and admitted that they suffer too. So like John gets hugged all the time by middle school and high school kids because they feel safe speaking openly to him. I am approached all the time by corporate professionals who thank me for being brave and open and vulnerable and sharing my story. And what I've learned is that my story is not unique. There's a lot of us out there who are afraid to speak openly about mental health or substance misuse. But what is unique, and what is unique about John, is that we are willing to share our stories, to help bring light to the fact that we must address mental health and well-being. No one is immune. Whether you're working in an entry-level position or you are the CEO of an organization, you are not immune from experiencing a mental health challenge. And my passion, after stepping away from my corporate job and leaving the entire salary on the table, every single penny of it, and forming Kim LaMontagne LLC, my passion is that I can teach through the lens of the lived experience and through the lens of the leader, and teach leaders how to transform the workplace culture so that everyone feels safe speaking openly about mental health. It is critical. Lives depend on it. 1 in 5 in your organization could be suffering. 1 in 5 directors, senior leaders around the boardroom table could be suffering in silence. Do you know who those people are? Most importantly, again, you do not need to be a counselor, but do you feel comfortable and confident? You can start a conversation with someone, create that little cocoon of safety that's judgment-free, really, truly see that person and get that person to the right resources. That is what I'm passionate about teaching leaders how to do. Just like John, we're sharing our stories to help others realize that they're not alone. Any feedback or additional thoughts about that, John?
Kim, I just kind of add one visual for your listeners. I so agree with what you're saying. And it comes from 5 years of travel. I just would like to create this image, which is an accurate image. I spoke some years ago when I certainly knew less about this than I do now, at one of the finest prep schools in the United States. They wouldn't have admitted me when I was going to high school, but I was allowed to speak there. So I had succeeded at some level. In any event, when I finished speaking at this school, and these people will be leaders themselves, amazing kids. The senior who introduced me that morning in the auditorium asked his classmates this question. If there's anyone in this auditorium this morning, he said, who has a mental health problem, or someone you love has a mental health problem, those were the only 2 categories. Would you please stand up? And I thought, no one's going to stand up here. It's not a problem here. After about 30 seconds, all but about 25 kids were standing up. First of all, I thought how brave they were. And I thought, even here, even now, they're brave enough. This generation is amazing. And they're going to change it, but we need to help them. That's Kim's message, I think. By helping them, you help your business.
You do.
And we need to, by the way, and I will say this to you, these young people will not join a company that's not going to understand their issues and is not willing to have the right conversations. And they will look to your policies too. They want you to walk the walk, don't just talk it. What do your policies say about mental health, What do your policies say about health coverage for mental health? What do your policies say about emergency days off? What do your policies say about mandatory vacation time that really is vacation time? Trust me, this generation is going to look for that. And if your company is offering it and the culture is right from the top down, you'll be able to attract and retain some really good people, because these kids today are amazingly talented and bright, but they're more sensitive to issues than perhaps the rest of us were.
I agree with you, John. And I was just the the closing keynote presenter last week for the Indiana Chamber of Commerce. They had a Recovery at Work Summit, and a senior executive from Cummins was one of the presenters. And Cummins has actually committed to global leadership training on mental health and well-being in the workplace, and created a program called It's Okay. And one of the things that they did, and I thought this was really great, is they identified areas where they could improve. And one of the things that they improved on was their access to the employee assistance program, which national usage rate of the employee assistance programs is about 3.5% to 5%. 75% of medium to large organizations offer it, but the usage rate is 3.5% to 5%. And that's fear, shame, and stigma in full force right there. But Cummins actually went directly to their EAP, and they said last year, we offered 8 visits for our employees per year for counseling. That's not going to cut it anymore. They doubled those visits to 16 visits for their employees, because they are committed to making sure that the mental health and well-being of their employees is being addressed. So there's creative ways that leaders can normalize the conversation, bring in more resources, train their leaders, but we have to first recognize that it's a problem, and it's here, and it's not going anywhere anytime soon. So we must be able to normalize that conversation.
You know, Kim, one of the things too, in the most recent past, everyone watching this will know it's true. When Naomi Osaka, the tennis player, couldn't do press conferences at the French Open, she was fined $15,000 and she had to withdraw. She later said, I suffer pretty serious depression. And then Simone Biles, maybe the greatest Olympic gymnast in the world, couldn't participate in the events because her head was not in sync with her body. And she received a lot of hate mail. She also received a lot of supportive mail. But she was acknowledging reality, which is, I may be a superstar, but I have issues too. Michael Phelps won 28 gold medals, talks about his depression. When we can start normalizing, understanding that there are Olympic athletes, NBA basketball players, NFL players, and high achieving work people like Kim who have these issues and are still great people, and we need to maximize their energy and their strength by supporting them, we'll change it. And we need to change it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. 100% agree. Ernesto, did you have any questions, or were there any questions in the chat that you would like either one of us to address at this time?
I sure do, and we have about 9 minutes, so maybe we'll do this kind of rapid fire. I do have some questions here. One of them is maybe it's a question / observation to kick it off, is that, you know, this entire discussion about mental health and the non-discriminatory language that you talked about earlier, Kim, this really has a lot of overlap with companies' diversity, equity, and inclusion policies, doesn't it?
Yes, yes, absolutely it does. And I'm glad that you mentioned that, because I actually work with a few diversity and equity and inclusion individuals within organizations, and they absolutely identified that it's all one and the same. It's all one and the same, because it includes it's the discriminatory practices, the stigma, that is something that we have to get through. And that's the same thing with diversity and inclusion. So it is all underneath that one umbrella. And there are DEI directors in organizations. What about a chief mental well-being officer? I met with Dartmouth-Hitchcock yesterday up in Lebanon, New Hampshire, and they have a director of well-being up there now. I was so excited to see that. The Department of Safety, like John said, they have a Department of Resilience and Wellness now. Every organization needs that, but it's all part of the DEI as well.
Yeah, thank you. And John, you have been, I think the numbers, you've spoken at more than 250 middle schools and high schools in the past 5 years. And that's a lot of kids that you've had a chance to talk to directly. Do you have a sense of what's behind this epidemic of depression and anxiety?
Well, I'm not a clinician, so I hesitate, but I have had the experience. A lot of what I see, which is anxiety and depression in kids as young as the 6th grade, I think it has a trigger in a lot of social, cultural pressures that none of us, at least people my age certainly, experience. These kids are living, they are driven by success, either their own drive or usually from others. They live in a virtual world. They live in a world that most adults now inhabit, but not like kids do. They spend 6 to 9 hours a day in a virtual world. A lot of the social emotional health that we grew up with was in the atmosphere. You know, in my own middle class home, we had family dinners every night. I knew all my neighbors, by the way. I knew all of their homes. I could have walked through them in the pitch dark and not run into furniture. And now people say, who lives across the street? Have you met those people? All of that translates, I think, into a very different world. Kids today, because of technology, and I'm not anti-tech, believe me, I have an iPad and an iPhone, but I grew up in an eyeball-to-eyeball world. These kids are not. And some of it's really making them smarter, but some of it, I think, is making them feel more alone. And I didn't coin the phrase, but it's apt. And the phrase for this generation, the younger people, is alone together. You watch kids walking with each other, friends, they're all looking at their palms. They're not usually looking their friends in the eye. They're too structured, too competitive. I'll just share this one brief comment from an 8th grade girl at a middle school in southern New Hampshire. I said to her, table of 8th grade girls, so they were thrilled. You can imagine having lunch with the old guy. And I said to them, hey, I understand your generation is stressed. Is that true? And then they started smiling. I could see the braces. And they said, we're so stressed. I said, that's what I've heard. Why is that? And then they said, because we're always trying to qualify for the next thing, so we'll be eligible for the thing after that. That was not my 8th grade life. And so a lot of these kids, I think, are responding to the external pressures, well-intended, but sometimes they have adverse consequences. I think all of us need to be more aware of it. And if everyone listening today had been at my elbow in these gyms and auditoriums, hearing these conversations, seeing the tears in their eyes, I think you'd feel as I do, which is we need to rethink how we're pressuring young people. We're shortening their childhoods. Not helpful. Not helpful.
That's a powerful observation. Kim, so somebody's listening who is a business owner or running a company or a leader in a leadership position. What's step one? What do they do first? You know, they've heard the presentation. I mean, it might seem like a lot of material. What's step one? Where do they get started?
Where they get started is they're here today. So congratulations for being here today and hearing the business case, why every leader, every business owner must pay attention to mental health and well-being in the workplace. So recognizing that it's a problem, first of all, and then taking action. I can help them personally by teaching and training their leadership and all of their employees about the 4 pillars, which I gave you a little glimpse into today. But it is a very extensive, comprehensive program. But the first thing is that we must identify that it's our job as leaders to model what a mentally healthy workplace culture looks like. And it's our job to arm our entire leadership team with the tools that they need to be able to feel confident, to have these difficult conversations, not as counselors, but many leaders are afraid of mental health and well-being. They're afraid to approach the topic because they don't know what to say. Honestly, sometimes just being there for someone is all you need to do. Recognizing that someone is having a problem and pushing through that fear and asking that employee, are you okay? So the first step, again, is recognizing that it's a problem. The second step is to train your leadership team to help identify and support and shift the culture about mental health in their organization.
Ernesto, I just wanted to add briefly, because Kim referenced it, if people watching this are interested, they could go online and read the email that went out from the president of Cisco and the president of Starbucks. It's just exactly what Kim said. It's not highfalutin. It's pretty honest. And leaders also, I think, to make the discussion move, have to be vulnerable themselves, have to be willing to share their own stressors. Because people respond to vulnerability, they respond to Kim, and kids respond to me. I'm the grandfather they've never met. But they will share stuff with me, Ernesto, they wouldn't share with their own parents because they know I'm safe. So the CEO, as Kim has said, create a safe environment, magic will happen.
I think what I sort of hear you saying there is something that I've encountered before in sort of leadership advice, which is that people in leadership roles need to be authentic and vulnerable at the same time as they're still sort of steering.
Absolutely.
You know, and be able to do both of those things at the same time. To say,
Absolutely.
this is hard or this is difficult, but also we're going to get through it, right?
Sometimes CEOs have approached employees and talked to them about the workplace, and they'll say, this has been a really hard time. I've been really stressed. I'm not sleeping some nights. It's really annoying, but how are you doing? Right? It doesn't have to be elaborate. It just needs to be you permission. I'm sharing something I'm experiencing. I bet you are too. That's powerful to people to say, well, maybe I don't have to be impenetrable here. That will mean a lot.
100%.
Well, I think we are at the top of the hour, and I think that's beautiful advice to finish the presentation on. Kim, thank you, and John, thank you. This was a really important conversation, and I think that I know I took a lot away from it today, and I'm confident that our audience did as well.
Yes, and I encourage anyone watching to reach out to John or I to have a conversation, to continue the conversation, and to know that we can make a change.
Absolutely.
But we have to talk about it first. We have to recognize it, and then we need to do something about it. And that's why we're here today. We are both here to support you along your journey, but we have to talk about it first. So thank you.
Well, and thank you to everyone who joined us today. Have a great rest of the week and a wonderful weekend. And thank you for being here. And thank you to Dartmouth-Hitchcock for making this presentation possible.
Great.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Be
you.
well, everyone.